Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Often an expansion, coupled with what the developers have said during that expansion, will give us clues about the future. In the case of an expansion like Warlords, it can tell us what the developers won't do in the future, and in the case of a successful expansion, it can tell us what they will do in the future. Today I'm going to go through, from a content perspective, what I think Legion means for the future, and I'll do a similar video on game systems at a later date. First of all, the patch cycle. I'm going to keep this point quite brief, but a more rapid patch cycle with a steady stream of content seems increasingly more likely. Why? Well, patch 7.1 was 2 months after the Legion release. Nighthold comes out in January, 7.1.5 is just about on the PTR, 7.2 is also in the works. Based off what Blizzard have said, it does seem unlikely that we will see a repeat of the Warlords of Draenor situation. I think a patch cadence like this is a pretty reasonable goal for them to have for the expansion after Legion. So let's get into the real content, starting off with the Old World. One big theme that we've seen with Legion is the use of Old World locations and content. 7.1 has a new dungeon in Karazhan, some new content in Dustwallow Marsh, our artifact quests involve the Old World, our Order Hall campaigns sometimes were involved in the Old World. On top of all of this, we've seen the developers talk about their scaling system and how it could be applied to Old World content based on how it performs in Legion, and I would wager that it's performed quite well in Legion so far. They also said they were happy with how the pre-expansion event played out, and they're actually looking to bring that gameplay back for patch 7.2. So when you think about it, it's a game called World of Warcraft. This implies an area larger than just that of the current expansion, and it seems a bit silly to leave all of those areas completely alone. I think it would be quite cool to have a reason to go back to these zones, and the events that Blizzard brought with the Legion pre-expansion event I think were a great proof of concept. Perhaps a similar system could be spun out in the future, one that would have zone-specific events going on across the world. It could be even tied to the weekly events, for an example, using a PvP world event to breathe new life into the arenas that are scattered around Azeroth, or say bring back the Defias Brotherhood as a threat that players contend with for a short time. To give you an idea of a player's story, imagine having a series of world quests going on that would lead into a scaled-up version of the Dead Mines. That's not content you'd play for weeks on end, but having things like that consistently appearing in the world would certainly freshen up areas of the game. Next, let's talk about world quests themselves. They've been a pretty big feature in Legion, and really they're more just wrapping types of content that we've already seen before. While there were some really cool ones associated with the Kirin Tor that are puzzles, I think it's fair to say that killing the same group of harpies over and over again can get a little bit old. I still do think that they're a good idea if done right. Given what we talked about previously with the Old World, I think the Old World is a great place to start with world quests. It would be great to have them sprinkled across some of the older regions of game in a way that's a bit more fun-focused, like say the Kirin Tor quests. There are some decently fun mechanics out there in the Old World, like the Plants vs. Zombie minigame, that just, they sit around there collecting dust. Bringing these back, as well as adding some new ones and then bulking out the Old World with more regular quests, could be a good addition if done right. Of course, it's good that players don't feel overloaded, so it's important that they take that into consideration. Now, these would be, or could be, tied to the endgame and would represent the threat of the day attacking the world, or they could go another route and have them be integrated into the sort of spirit of what the old zones were, perhaps reflecting some narrative changes. While it would take time to make new quests, it wouldn't take much art time as the models, art, etc. already built. Ideally, this would involve some new factions for the Alliance and Horde and could be a part of a wider game system, the type of which we could maybe see added to from patch to patch, rather than be something like the Cataclysm revamp that just takes this ridiculous amount of work initially to actually build. I also think that world quests will likely feature in the next expansion, but in a way that's a bit less static than the current one. I think it would be ideal if less world quests spawned, but each one would lead into others. World quests are good when you end up with a group of people tackling multiple ones together, and that doesn't really happen too often. Instead, players are left feeling quite isolated. I think it would be great if, after completing a quest, the group would be sent onto something new that would spawn based on the completion of the current quest you were doing. I think this would have some good gameplay potential and keep players together in a more social way. Definitely borrowing a bit from Guild Wars 2 there, but given what Blizzard have been saying, and I think some of their goals with the version 1 of World Quests, I think that is a pretty logical continuation of what they could be. That's roughly what I would expect from the next iteration of daily quest world content anyway, based on what Legion has displayed so far. Next, 5-player content. So one of the largest bits of feedback over the last few years is people wanted more 5-player content. In MoP, they tried to scratch that itch by adding some heroic scenarios. In Warlords, they basically gave up. And then in Legion, they really refocused a large part of the endgame towards 5-player content with the likes of Mythic Plus and Karazhan. Overall, I think that's worked out quite well, and I would expect to see more stuff along those lines in the future. The main thing that we see from Legion is a new systemic wrapping for dungeons, so I would expect that future expansions will keep that going with tweaks to how that system works. I'm specifically referring to Mythic Plus here, in the form of new affixes, modifying old affixes, and tuning rewards. They have claimed that adding new dungeons is more beneficial to a system like this, which is something that I would expect, and we do see that patch 7.2 is bringing a new dungeon with it, and it's also splitting Karazhan into 2 and then putting both of those into the Mythic Plus system, so I think we already are seeing some clear action in that regard, and much like with how we saw that raids were successful and they're just going to continue on as they were with raids, I think now that dungeons are successful, they're just going to continue on along those lines with dungeons in the future. And speaking of raids, well, let's talk about raids. I think we will see a similar style of raid content, but in a manner that is more decoupled from patch content. Their goal is for each slice of raid content to be about 4 to 5 months apart, at least that's what they said and have been saying for the last few months. With their current schedule, it looks like that will be the case for Emerald Nightmare and Nighthold. They also said that they are, and this was at BlizzCon, happy to decouple the raid release date from the patches that deliver them, such that we can have a patch cadence that isn't defined by when the game needs to have a new raid. Overall, I think that could lead to a more smooth kind of amount of raid content that's a bit more manageable for players. Finally, we see that they're more comfortable with there being smaller raids, especially with the addition of the Trial of Valor, so I would expect a more consistent raid release schedule containing smaller raids, rather than us having to wait for absolutely ages for a 13-boss behemoth like Hellfire Citadel. Next, quest content. And I don't mean level up quest content, I mean endgame quest content. There's a lot of that stuff in Legion. Between Illidan, the 7.0 Suramar content, the 7.1 Suramar content, Profession content, Order Halls, Legion has a lot of single-player stuff going on. This makes sense as a response to Warlords of Draenor's lackluster performance in this category, but what might it actually mean for the future? Well, while many, myself included, think that WoW is best played with friends, it is true that single-player content has its place. And from what I can tell, a lot of the players right now who have really enjoyed a lot of that single-player content with Legion, and maybe have dabbled in a bit of multiplayer but aren't that interested in it, it seems like they are maybe beginning to drop off with Legion. I think that is unavoidable to a degree, and the main future of the game does lie in multiplayer content, but I think that getting more single-player content is something that Blizzard will probably try to do a little bit more in the future. They've already started doing that with Legion a bit. Legion had a big focus on all the different classes, and I'm assuming they're not going to do that next time, and therefore we'll have a lot more resources free to make more endgame quest content that will cater to all characters. So overall, I think it's an interesting topic. As an aside, I think that proper reputations with their own story quests and mounts like what we used to get would be a good way for Blizzard to try to keep this category of player, which is actually a category that I sometimes do end up slipping into from time to time. I think it's bizarre to me that Suramar is the only rep that's got decently unique content, but yes, overall, I would expect that this uptick in kind of bespoke quest-ish, narrative-ish content that we've seen with Legion's endgame, I expect that will continue into the next expansion and most likely increase in its quantity. Next, I want to briefly touch on PvP content. So patch 7.2 is bringing the PvP Brawl feature, which will allow Blizzard to put more kind of creative and off-the-wall rule sets into Battleground content, which should allow them to field test new ideas and overall learn a lot more about PvP gameplay in a mostly risk-free manner. They've already said that successful brawls might see a permanent spot in the game, so I would expect that we'll see them incorporate what they have learned from this into the PvP content of the next expansion. First, I imagine the brawl system will continue. I could see it expanding into something a bit more robust, like Overwatch's new arcade system. Legion revamped the progression of PvP. I suspect that the next expansion might try to revamp something on the content side of things a bit more now that they have a progression system that they, I assume, are happy with. Content-wise, I've got to imagine they'll also add a new battleground because, come on, it's been 3.5 years since we last saw a new one in-game, and that really is a little bit ridiculous. And just to cap this video off with a super quick little short list of things that I also want to mention, I think we'll get more scenarios. In 7.2, they're having a scenario where groups of 3 players head up to Legion battleships after the invasion event-style things that go on in the world. 7.0 had the Wither training scenario, so I would imagine that they're getting a bit more comfortable with using that scenario tech in a sensible manner in-game, so I could see more of that happening. I could also see less, comparatively a bit less level up content, and then more of that being shifted to the end game as far as questing goes. So maybe we'll get, something that's a bit more like Suramar, that's perhaps more expanded and larger in the next expansion. That could be the case. And then also, I think we'll get more PvP events in the world, like the little arenas that they've got going on throughout the World Quest system. But really, overall, that is what I think we can infer about the next expansion, based off the things that we've seen so far, the things that Blizzard have talked about, and what, at least I suspect, is the stuff that's been doing quite well with Legion. Obviously, there will be a whole bunch of stuff which we just can't predict. The new sort of title features that are really pushing the envelope forward. These are the more evolutionary things that I expect from the next expansion. But that's it for the video. Let me know what kind of things you'd like to see in the next expansion, or sort of what things you think Legion might carry forward into the next one. But that's basically it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.